Hello everyone. Today I am making the other movie. This should be the last movie for chapter 17 based on the textbook, or chapter 4 based on my course syllabus. Okay, this is the last slide from previous movie. This slide I also explained in previous movie. That's why now I'm going to a new slide. Okay, real GDP per person. Real GDP, we already looked at how to find real GDP from previous movies, or we learned already how to find real GDP from previous movie. But in this case, not real GDP, but real GDP per person. What does it mean per person? Per person, it means per each people. That's why real GDP per person, it means real GDP per each people. Real GDP per person is calculate the output per person produced and consumed in one country in a period of time. So when we talk about, or when we consider about output per person, this is real GDP per person. But I think you still remember how to calculate a real GDP from previous movie. So we can calculate real GDP by using three methods, or three ways, or three techniques. One is production, the other one is expenditure, and last one is income. Okay, when we're talking about production, this is the activities of producing goods services. This is the performance of producing goods services. That's why when we act of production, we will get output. That's why it should be production per person. This is output. But when we're talking about expenditure or income, this is referred to currency value. Okay, currency amount, not value, currency amount. That's why normally in the work, when we're talking about income per person or real GDP per person in terms of not real GDP. When we're talking about GDP per person by using income, normally we use nominal GDP. Okay, so GDP by income to GDP by expenditure, normally we use nominal GDP. Why? Because nominal GDP using current year price. So expenditure per person, income per person, that means refer to amount of money that each person spent in this period, each amount of money that each person earned in this period. That's why when we're talking about income per person or expenditure per person, we tend to use nominal GDP per person, because this is using amount of money. Amount of money refer to current price. When we're talking about output per person, normally we use a real GDP per person, because in order to get output, you need to perform. You need to make a physical production of movement of production, the act of production. This is a real activity. Okay, but in this case, output per person, that's why a real GDP per person. Real GDP per person is used to check the standard of living in one country. So normally one country have a higher standard. It means that every people in this country have more output to consume, or it means when one country has higher standard of living, it means that everyone in this country can produce more output. Okay, if everyone can produce more output, it means they can use more output as well. So when they use more output, they can enjoy with a higher enjoyment or higher happiness. So when they live in an enjoyment situation or enjoyable situation, or they live in a happier situation, their standard of living tend to be higher. Okay, in order to calculate a real GDP per person, for one country, you need to calculate GDP for that country, and you need to have national population for that country. By taking a real GDP from that country divided by national population of that country, you will have a real GDP per person for that country. For example, if you want to find a real GDP per person in Cambodia 2019, you need to know real GDP in Cambodia for 2019, and need to know how many people in Cambodia in 2019. That's why take a real GDP in 2019 divided by Cambodian national population 2019, you will get a real GDP per person in 2019 for Cambodia. And yes, we already know how to find real GDP. Okay, and how to get a national population. You can get national population maybe from census or from survey. It is also real GDP per person is also called a real GDP per capita. Per person and per capita are the same. Okay, per person and per capita are the same meaning. So far, some students, they thought that this if we need to put L to be capital. They say real GDP per capital. Real GDP per capital. There's no real GDP per capital. If you put L here, it's wrong. Don't put L here, because original word per capita, not per capital. Okay, per capita it means per person. So don't put L at the end of capital. So why they use this one? This one we use in the work. This one we use in the study. So when you attend a seminar, workshop or meeting that topic about GDP or standard of living or maybe economic well-being, so they will hear, or you will hear the speaker say per capita. They never say per person. This is for item for work, this is item for learning, for study. This is the word for working, this is the word for studying. But they have the same meaning. Even though real GDP per capita is used to measure the standard of living in one country, but real GDP per capita is not the perfect measures of economic well-being. What does mean economic well-being? That means that economic being well. Okay, you are being well. What does it mean? What does it mean if you say that you are being well? It is say that you are being well. It means that you are in the well condition, the well situation. So real GDP per person is used, or per capita is used to measure the standard of living, but it's not a perfect measurement in order to measure the economic well-being. Why? This is because real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account of increased leisure time. What does mean leisure time? Leisure time is relaxed time. That relaxed time, that means the time that you are not working time. Okay. Leisure time, that means not working time. GDP per person or GDP or real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account of increasing or relaxed time. Real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account of non-market economic activity. What does it mean non-market economic activity? Is economic activity but not in the market. So where? Maybe in household or maybe in society. This economic activity, when we perform economic activity, we will use Q, quantity. But in household we will use Q, in society we use Q, but not in the market. Not in market you cannot find market price. If you have Q, but if you don't have price, you cannot find market value. If you cannot find market value, you cannot take this one into real GDP, because real GDP or GDP is a total market value. We have a quantity, we use quantity, but we don't have price. That's why we cannot find market value. So this quantity cannot take into GDP. Okay. The other one, real GDP or real GDP per person, not take into account in terms of the environmental quality and resource depletion or resource reduction. Real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account increases or decreases the quality of life. Real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account in terms of poverty and economic inequality, because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because of these 5 point reasons, that's why real GDP per capita is not the same thing as economic well-being. It's not. Okay. So we look at one by one here. Real GDP or real GDP per capita does not take into account in terms of increase in leisure time. For example, whether these people in this country have shorter work time or not per week. That means normally we maybe 5 day and half morning of Saturday, or maybe 5 day a week. 5 day and half 5.5 day a week or 5 day a week. But if you work only 2 days a week or maybe 3 days a week, GDP not take into account in terms of you work shorter or longer time per week. Okay, so GDP does not take into account whether you work short time per week or long time per week. GDP or real GDP does not take into account whether you start to work earlier or late. GDP does not take into account in terms of you want to retire, you retire early or retire late. Okay, but this one will capture in economic well-being. GDP not capturing, but economic well-being capture. Because of this is the first reason, that's why real GDP per person is not the same thing as economic well-being. Second reason, real GDP does not take into account in terms of non-market economic activities. What are they? Household production, volunteer service. Okay, household production, volunteer service. So in this case, yes, household production. For example, your mom cook food for you, clean house for you, wash clothes for you. Your mom does activity production, household production. They will use your mom will use household output, but we don't have price. If we don't have price, we cannot find market value. If we cannot find market value, this activity cannot take into real GDP. The other one, volunteer service. This is social work, not household work, social production, not household production. But in terms of volunteer service, the volunteer, they perform work by producing output, but there's no compensation. There's no return to them in terms of wage, in terms of salary or compensation. That's why we don't have price. Volunteer, they perform activity or they produce activities or produce goods. That's why we have quantity, but they don't have price. Because they don't have price, we cannot find market value. If we cannot find market value, again, we cannot take this output into GDP. Non-market activity are more important in poor countries. It means volunteer service are more important in poor countries because poor country has less money to pay. That's why they need staff who work for free. So most poor country welcome people work as volunteer, including local people work as volunteer or people from rich country work as volunteer. Okay. The other one, non-market economic activity refer to underground economy. Underground economy refer to economic activities that has no report. Economic activity has no report. They produce output. They also have price. Actually, we could find a market value for this activity, but without report, we don't have this one. If we don't have this one, we cannot take this one into real GDP. Unreported economic activity including legal activity and illegal activity. When we're talking about illegal, normally they have report, but this report they don't send to government. That's why we assume that this is non-report. But legal activity without report, most are, I can say that are what we can say official unofficial what we can say illegal, informal activities. Informal activity, they are legal but no report. For example, when you go to, yes, in our country, when you go to as a motor taxi driver, or maybe motor driver, or maybe a tuk-tuk driver, or maybe the seller sell fruit, sell meat, sell fish, or pork, or maybe beef, or they sell vegetable along the street in the public market, not supermarket, in public market. You can see many people sell along the street, but they don't have report. So they perform activity. They are not illegal. They are legal. No police go to arrest them, to catch them. They are legal, but they sell. They perform without a report. That's why we don't know what is or how much is market activity for these sellers, for this motor driver or tuk-tuk driver, because they never take a report. Okay. That's why in this case we call unofficial, informal sector. Okay, underground economy in terms of legal activity we call informal sector. They perform legally but no report. Yes, we have a lot in our country. For example, again, you go to tuk-tuk driver, motor taxi driver, or maybe some taxi driver, car driver, they don't have a report. They don't have receipt. That's why no report. But when you go to Grab, for example, Grab or maybe Pass app, yes, they have report because they have system. Those one is not legal, it's not informal. Grab driver or Pass app driver, they have system. Okay, so when you pay, amount that you pay, we go to system. That's why they have report. But the problem is they send to government or not. Okay, if they not send, this is we call underground economy. But if they send to government, we not count them as underground economy because we can calculate their activity. Okay, real GDP does not take into account in terms of environmental qualities and resource depletion. For example, real GDP per person or real GDP does not take into account whether this country is poor qualities of environment or not. If this country has a poor quality environment, people may get more health problems. When they get health problems, they are not economic well-being. But they can produce. When they can work, they can produce. Real GDP capture them, but they live in a poor quality environment. They tend to have more disease. Okay, they has more health problems. That's why this one not capture into real GDP, but this one capture the cost of reduced quality environment quality will capture by economic well-being, but not captured by real GDP. GDP is not adjusted for resource depletion. Okay, GDP is not counting to the resource that you used that you still have in your countries. But well-being, because if you have more resource, you can to live with a well condition. But real GDP does not take into account whether resource, how much resource you have. But real GDP just take into account that resource that you are using to produce goods and services. Real GDP does not take into account in terms of increases or decreases the quality of life. For example, whether this country have more crime rate or not. If more crime rates, higher crime rates, it means that this country are not security, not really secure country. That's why people live in this country tend to be feel like scary or maybe risk every time. And the other one, whether GDP, real GDP does not take into account in terms of traffic congestion. Okay, so real GDP does not take into account in terms of traffic congestion, but economic well-being take into account. Because when you live in country or city with a lot of traffic, your situation tend to be worse. That you feel non-comfortable, your life tend to be worse. That's why economic well-being tend to be dropped down. But GDP not saying about this one. The other one, GDP not saying about public or community organization. But well-being is captured this one. Because if you live in one community, if the government here or authority here is organization here, it's not working well, so you tend to be not satisfied. When you are not satisfied, your economic well-being tend to be dropped down. Okay. The other one, real GDP does not take into account in terms of poverty, economic inequality. So you can see, yes, you can go to the textbook for more. I just capture a short one. GDP does not capture effects of income inequality. Income inequality refers to the gap between the poor income and the rich income in the country. Okay, so GDP does not take into account in terms of the gap between the poor earn and the rich earn. But economic well-being in one country will understand this gap, because if the poor earn too much less than the rich, so the poor situation tend to be not a well situation. Okay, so this is, however, they found that the people live in a country with higher GDP often leads to increased life expectancy at birth. Why? Because they can attain higher or good quality medical care. They can attend higher education. That's why they tend to know how to protect themselves from risk, from disease, from disaster. and they tend to have good food to eat. They tend to know how to live with a good condition. That's why their life tend to be longer. The other way, people live in higher GDP country tend to decrease. Infant, that means baby mortality die. This is baby die. Okay. So maybe they were born maybe a week or maybe a month and they die, including this one. So normally people live in a higher country GDP. Higher GDP country tend to have less baby die, and they protect themselves from disease, from risk. They know that, and people live in a higher GDP country tend to have enough food, enough drink to satisfy their life. Okay, this is data that you can see by your own. There are many indicators to compare developing country, poorest country, and developed country or industrial countries. You can see in terms of good indicator, positive indicator, you can see rich country tend to be more okay, but in terms of negative indicator, rich country tend to be less. This is negative, die. Rich country less. This is maybe no. This is not legible window. This is tend to be less. Okay, you can see by your own. That's one. This is the last slide for this movie. The last slide, this chapter. Although real GDP per person is not the same thing as economic well-being in one country, but real GDP per person is still a useful indicator, a useful measures to reflect the economic well-being in that country. That means it's not a good one, but it's not perfect one, but it's still there's no the other one better than this one. That's why still one is a useful one. It's not perfect one for measure economic well-being, but it's a useful one in order to reflect, in order to show, in order to present economic well-being in this country. This is because the country with higher real GDP per capita not only enjoy higher average standard of living, but also they also tend to have higher life expectancies, low rate of infant and child mortality, and high rate of schooling and good health assessments. Okay, this is the last slide, but before finishing this one, you can go to your textbook. On this page you can see recap. Okay, now it's time for you to work.